tube amps are dead, and it doesn't matter. That's the unfortunate direction that things are going, or it would appear as though things are going. Today, I heard some news that vacuum tubes, yes, the little glass things that make the tone search so worth it for us guitar players, are going to become very, very difficult, much more difficult than before to get. And that's because of a few things. One, higher demand during this period of time. People are loving guitars, so that's a good thing. The supply chain crisis obviously affects everything, including vacuum tubes. And most importantly, not very many people make these things anymore. And most of them come from overseas. And if you're paying attention to the news, there are certain events that are causing some issues with importing vacuum tubes. And it has companies scrambling. Prices on tube amps are going up. So if you have one, hang on to it. And if you want to know more about that side of it, check out Rhett Shull's video. Phenomenal job explaining the history of tube amps, tubes, and how we got here. But what I want to focus on this video is the fact that this doesn't matter for most of us. And I would argue it really doesn't matter for almost all of us, because while it is going to be more difficult and more expensive to get tube amps, you have so many other options. Now, for me, I have a home studio. I have a tube amp that's 22 watts, and I'm going to tell you right now, it is too loud for this home studio. I wish I had a smaller amp. This was actually a downgrade from what I used to have. So for most people, we can't even use our tube amplifiers at the volume that they're meant to be used because they're just too loud. So what I find myself doing more often than not is playing with a plug-in. And you can hear, I mean, it sounds pretty good. I didn't spend much time dialing this in, but I mean, pretty convincing. It's a Fender Tweed 50s kind of thing with mic modeling and all sorts of stuff. So for me, it's practical. It makes sense. And I would argue that for most people, you don't need a tube amp. Yes, it's the holy grail of tone, and there's something fun about the search, but you don't need it because, let's face it, and I don't mean this to be insulting, but most people who play guitar aren't recording. Most people aren't gigging. They're collecting. They're kind of in love with the search for gear and buying gear, and that's cool, and that's totally fine. I have the same issue. However, that means that this isn't that big of a deal because the people who do gig in big arenas are going to have a stockpile of tubes, and they're going to be able to get the tubes, and they're going to continue. And they're the ones who have the time to sit there and tweak where an amplifier is in a room and a microphone sits, and it really does matter for them. But again, for the majority of people, you have things like the Line 6 Helix, the Kemper, Logic plugins are amazing. Universal Audio, amp modeling, you name it, there's a ton of them out there, and they're really, really, really good. Are they the same as a tube amp in a room cranked up? Absolutely not. I can tell you that for certain they aren't, but they get you really close. And for most people, myself included, that's fine, because you know what? I'm not a professional recording engineer. That's where the other part of this comes in, is you can have the most amazing sounding rig, and if you don't know how to put a microphone in front of it and properly record it, it doesn't matter. And I can tell you, I am not one of those people who can do that. I can get close, I can get lucky, but I really don't have the talent or skill as far as a recording engineer to be able to even translate what I do to a recording properly. So for me, it's so much easier to be able to record something. I don't have to commit to an EQ setting or a tone or a drive setting. I can just record, and then later on in the mixing process, that's where I can dial it in through some trial and error. And if I didn't do that and I went with the more traditional route of miking a tube amp, I mean, you can still do some post-processing, but for me, I really, really, really like to have that flexibility. And maybe it's a fear of tone commitment on my end, but you know, stuff like this. Sounds just fine for me. So those are my thoughts. It's unfortunate. It's true. But it's one of those things where I think this is the direction we're heading. And the purist in me doesn't like it. I do have a tube amp, so I don't have to rush out and go buy one. But to be honest with you, it doesn't get used as much as it used to, especially as the digital versions have gotten better. Now, I know there's going to be guitar players out there who crucify me for this, but I'm sorry. It's just the reality. Tubes are becoming more difficult to get. Tube amps are always going to be there, but they don't need to be anymore. They don't need to be anymore. And that's just the reality of it. They've served their purpose, and the tone is amazing. But if you can get 95% of the way there, I would argue even 99% of the way there, if you know how to use your equipment, it just doesn't matter. So if that interests you, please consider subscribing to the channel, like, comment, dislike. Let's have a discussion. Those of you who are not guitar players, if you have questions as to what I'm even talking about, please feel free to ask those as well. And we'll see you next time.